Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a topic that's sending shockwaves across the global defense community, the growing reports that Russia could run out of nearly everything essential for its war effort by 2026. This isn't just about tanks or missiles. It's about the entire military, industrial system reaching its breaking point. As the war in Ukraine drags on, the cracks in Russia's economic and military foundations are becoming more visible than ever before. What started as a confident show of strength is slowly turning into a battle of survival, not just on the battlefield, but inside Russia's own factories, supply chains, and economy. The truth is, modern warfare is not only fought with weapons, but with logistics, technology, and resources. And that's where Russia is struggling the most. When the invasion of Ukraine began in 2022, Moscow was confident that its stockpiles would last for years. But after more than 3 years of intense fighting, those reserves have been drained at an alarming rate. The Kremlin has been pushing production into overdrive, but experts say it simply cannot sustain this pace for much longer. The biggest issue is not the number of tanks or shells being produced, it's the loss of industrial capacity. Russia's factories are working 24/7, but many rely on outdated Soviet-era machinery. Decades of corruption and underinvestment have left the country's defense industry unable to compete with modern Western technology. Every missile, every drone, every tank component requires parts that Russia used to import from Europe, the United States, or Asia. Now, with sanctions cutting off those supplies, Moscow is scrambling to find replacements, often turning to China, North Korea, and Iran for help. But even those alliances have limits. China is cautious about openly violating sanctions, while North Korea's capacity to supply ammunition and missiles is limited. Iran has been providing drones, but those are only a fraction of what Russia needs. In the long run, Moscow's reliance on these partners could become a trap, creating dependency rather than strength. Let's talk about tanks first. Russia began the war with around 3,000 operational tanks and thousands more in storage. But after years of heavy losses, they've pulled old T-55 and T-62 tanks models from the 1950s and 1960s out of storage and sent them to the front. While Russia claims to have ramped up production of the more modern T-90 and T-14 Armata, the numbers tell a different story. Independent analysts estimate that Russia is producing fewer than 250 new tanks a year, while losing hundreds more in combat. By 2026, unless something changes, those stockpiles of usable tanks could be nearly exhausted. And it's not just tanks. Artillery shells, the backbone of Russia's battlefield strategy, are also running low. Russia has fired millions of shells since 2022, sometimes up to 60,000 a day in the war's early months. That rate of fire is simply unsustainable. The country's factories cannot produce enough ammunition to replace what's being used. Even with help from North Korea, which has reportedly sent millions of shells. Analysts say Russia's shell supply could become critical by 2026 if the war continues at this intensity. The Air Force is also feeling the strain. The loss of modern aircraft like the Su-34 and Su-35 has forced Russia to rely more on older models. Sanctions have hit the aviation sector hard. Spare parts, advanced avionics, and microchips are increasingly difficult to obtain. Many Russian jets are flying with outdated systems or parts scavenged from older planes. This reduces combat effectiveness and increases accident risks. Pilots are pushing their aircraft beyond safe limits because replacements simply aren't available. Another key weakness lies in Russia's missile and drone programs. Moscow has been launching hundreds of long-range missiles and kamikaze drones at Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. But every missile uses imported electronic components, microchips, sensors, navigation systems, most of which are now sanctioned. To keep production going, Russia has turned to smuggling networks, using countries like Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Armenia as middlemen. But this workaround can't last forever. Western intelligence agencies are tightening export controls, and as supply chains shrink, missile production will slow down dramatically. By 2026, analysts predict Russia may face serious shortages in precision, guided weapons. Without those, its military will rely more on unguided bombs and artillery, which are less effective and cause far more collateral damage. This shift could make the Russian war effort even more brutal, but also less strategic, wasting resources without achieving major gains. Economically, the pressure is just as severe. The Russian economy is now operating in wartime mode, but that comes at a huge cost. Around 40% of the national budget is being spent on the military. While oil and gas revenues have kept the economy afloat, sanctions and the price cap on Russian crude have reduced profits. The government is printing money to cover expenses, causing inflation to surge. The ruble has lost much of its value, and ordinary Russians are feeling the pain: rising prices, job shortages, and declining living standards. The labor shortage is another hidden crisis. Hundreds of thousands of young Russians have been killed or wounded in the war, and hundreds of thousands more have fled abroad to avoid conscription. Factories are now hiring older workers, prisoners, and even migrants to fill the gaps. Skilled engineers and technicians, the backbone of defense production, are in short supply. Without them, even the best machinery can't produce enough weapons to meet the front's demands. There's also a technological collapse underway. Western sanctions have cut Russia off from semiconductors, advanced machinery, and even basic industrial software. The few remaining suppliers in Asia are under growing pressure to stop backdoor exports. This means that over time, Russia's ability to produce complex weapons like modern tanks, missiles, or aircraft will degrade. Even if it can produce simpler weapons, its technological edge will keep shrinking compared to NATO standards. Some experts argue that Russia might still endure after all. It has vast natural resources and a centralized economy that can be redirected toward war. But history shows that economic isolation and overextension eventually lead to collapse. The Soviet Union fell partly because of the same reasons we're seeing today: an unsustainable arms race, low productivity, and technological stagnation. The Kremlin has tried to hide these weaknesses through propaganda. Russian state media continues to claim record weapon production, new alliances, and unstoppable offensives. But satellite imagery and economic data tell a different story. Storage depots once filled with ammunition are now nearly empty. Factories that were once silent are working non-stop, but the output isn't enough. Even the black market for parts and electronics is drying up as the West improves enforcement. If the war continues into 2026 and beyond, Russia will likely face difficult choices. Either it drastically cuts back operations to conserve resources, or it risks a total industrial breakdown. The first option means losing momentum on the battlefield. The second could mean economic disaster at home. Either way, the outcome looks grim. Meanwhile, Ukraine, with steady Western support, is improving its technology and production capacity. Western nations are building ammunition plants across Europe, increasing deliveries of long-range weapons, and training more Ukrainian troops. The gap between Russian and Western supported forces is widening, and by 2026, that gap could become overwhelming. This timeline also puts pressure on Russia's leadership. Vladimir Putin has staked his entire political legacy on victory in Ukraine. But as the costs rise and resources dwindle, maintaining public support becomes harder. Already, signs of strain are emerging: regional governors complaining about funding shortages, factories missing production targets, and soldiers' families demanding answers. If shortages hit the military hard enough, morale could collapse. Russia's attempts to reorient its economy toward Asia haven't yielded the results the Kremlin hoped for. China, India, and others are buying cheap Russian oil, but they're also exploiting the situation to their advantage. They pay less, set their own terms, and avoid deeper commitments. This leaves Moscow isolated and dependent. Even friendly countries are careful not to violate Western sanctions too blatantly. In other words, Russia's global influence is shrinking, not growing. By 2026, the world might see a Russia that is militarily exhausted, economically weakened, and politically unstable. The illusion of endless power that once defined the Kremlin's propaganda could vanish under the weight of its own unsustainable war machine. The tanks, missiles, and drones that once symbolized Russia's might are now symbols of its overreach machines that can no longer be replaced fast enough to keep the illusion alive. In the end, this isn't just a story about numbers or equipment. It's about the limits of power in the modern age. No matter how large a military appears on paper, it cannot survive without the economic and technological systems that sustain it. And Russia, despite its vast territory and resources, is discovering that isolation, corruption, and war fatigue can destroy even the most formidable armies. If the experts are right, the next year or two will be crucial. Russia will either find a way to scale down its ambitions or risk running out of everything from weapons and manpower to the political will needed to continue. The clock is ticking, and every day of war brings Moscow closer to that breaking point. For now, all the world can do is watch as history unfolds a reminder that wars of attrition don't just drain armies, they drain nations. And if current trends continue, by 2026, Russia could face the very night where it once believed impossible, a military machine running on empty. Thank you for watching, and if you found this video informative, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more updates on global defense and geopolitics. Stay tuned because the story of Russia's struggle is far from over, but its outcome may already be written.